There is nothing more unesthetic than a policeman. I'm Eddie Webb,
And I'm an unesthetic policeman.
and today we're going to talk about the Peter Cushing era, the 1960s of Sherlock Holmes, here on Genreless. Hello and welcome back to our Sherlock Holmes run of Genreless, and we are here to talk about the 1960s of Sherlock Holmes. And before I get into this, I do want to correct something I have since found out about from last episode. Last episode I said I thought 1954 Ronald Howard show was the first televised Sherlock Holmes. Turns out that's incorrect. There was a 1951 British Sherlock Holmes television show, but it doesn't exist anymore. We've talked about this on Doctor Who, but there was a policy of junking tapes in the BBC until the late 60s. And so the entirety of the 51 Sherlock Holmes series is gone. We have no copies of it as far as we know. And it went even as far as the show we're about to talk about today. Large chunks of this show no longer exist. So there's an entire chunk of British Sherlock Holmes TV that just we don't have access to, which is why I didn't know about it until I started digging into researching.
Well, it's
Correction.
because I don't know why the British think they should claim Sherlock Holmes, Eddie. It's not like it was a British writer that created Holmes.
British writer creating British characters in London. No, I can't think why they would have any kind of control or authority over that. America should definitely control the image of them. America. And the 60s were kind of a weird time for Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock Holmes, much like vampires and zombies, are cyclical. So allow me to explain. All three of them tend to go in and out of popular culture. They don't ride bicycles. They actually go in and out of popular culture. And
I will push back against that assertion. If Sherlock Holmes is a Victorian era character, I'm willing to bet Holmes would ride a bicycle.
canonically, he's only ridden a bicycle once.
Aha!
That was in The
Prove it.
Solitary Cyclist.
I
Actually,
would
no, I take
love
it
to
back.
see.
No, I'm wrong. Watson was the one who rode the bicycle. Holmes didn't.
I would love to see the horror movie where it's just zombies riding bicycles. That's it. That's the whole movie.
Right.
Because if it actually worked and their muscles worked like that, they could ride that bicycle endlessly because they should never technically get tired.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And they just go around on little kind of unicycle zombies even better. Just his balance.
Because the vampire can only ride it till dawn, and then he's got to like bounce or else he's dust.
Right.
All right, sorry.
Exactly.
So total digression now. That's gonna be my next book, by the way.
Now.
Cyclist horror.
Oh, cyclist horror. The bicycles are draining our blood. No. So all three of them fall in and out of fashion, although they never really completely disappear. And even though we skipped over about 20 years from the last official Sherlock Holmes story being published to the first chunk we looked at, in reality, in the publishing side, Sherlock Holmes never really went away. There was lots of knockoffs and homages and pastiches going on well after Conan Doyle's death.
Can you list for us that are not as steeped in Holmesian lore as you some of the knockoffs that you just mentioned?
I think the most prominent one would I just fell out of my head. August Derleth wrote it. He wrote. August Derleth wrote these stories. They were because he asked permission to write Sherlock Holmes, and Doyle said no. So he said, "Well, fine, I'll make my own detective with hookers, solar ponds." That's what I'm thinking of.
August Derleth, the famed savior of Lovecraftian lore that never created any sort of legal issues for other writers. That August Derleth.
Yes, that August Derleth, who also made his own. I found out made his own uh, John Carter of Mars knockoff, which is amazingly even more offensive than the original John
Ugh,
Carter novels.
that just
Yeah.
sounds like it should then be called Races of Venus, and we call it a day.
The short version is he takes drugs, actually projects to a whole new planet, falls in love with a 14-year-old girl, and tries to marry her, and that's the first two chapters.
Wow.
Yeah, it's bad. The Solar Pond stories are pretty good. I will say that. Um, but also, most famously, the writer of the Lupin novels introduced a character named Sherlock Holmes. He got hit with the Victorian equivalent of a cease and desist. And so he changed name to Sherlock Holmes, uh, which is just amazing. Uh, and hilariously, there's actually was the one of the very first stories references Sherlock Holmes. It was only later stories where he was explicitly a character that got hit. So both Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes both exist in the Dupin novels or the Lupin novels. So yeah, so there's a lot of this stuff going on. Um, as we talked about, 30s and 40s, Holmes roars back into popularity. The 50s were kind of a lot of cashing in on that, as we saw, to reasonable success. Um, but around the 60s, we start to get a shift towards authenticity. Because a lot of the 30s, 40s, 50s, as we saw, were kind of things written vaguely in the spirit of Sherlock Holmes. And so around them and say, well, what about the original stories? Let's start adapting them, the actual original material, adapt them not as let's take this character and do new stuff with them, but let's adapt them as we would adapt any other novel or play or whatnot. And so we get to the show we're going to talk about today. This is actually the second series of Sherlock Holmes. There was an earlier series done in black and white with a different actor that we have no evidence of anymore. And then that actor did not come back. And so they asked Peter Cushing to take over as Holmes, although the actor who played Watson, Nigel Stock, did both series. And so Peter Cushing did this one because he had done Sherlock Holmes in a Hammer horror adaptation of Hound of Baskervilles, which we alluded to. And he's like, I would love to do Sherlock Holmes again. And Peter Cushing was an avid reader of the original stories, and so he wanted to do Sherlock Holmes correctly. He felt like all of these 30s, 40s, 50s versions were not the accurate and authentic Holmes. And that's where this kind of correction comes in, is that we start getting people who are like, no, we want to do what was actually written in the books, not these adaptations.
You keep saying Peter Cushing. I
Yeah.
myself am a millennial and have no idea who Peter Cushing is.
Okay,
Who
none
is
of
this
what you just
random
said is
person?
true. None of what you said is true. Peter
Dude,
Cushing
don't
is
make
a
me go to my TikTok right now and put this recording on there.
Peter Cushing is a British actor who's mostly known for his work on the Hammer horror films. He became kind of a cult icon of horror and adventure movies, including his absolute best role and his definitive role, which is that of Doctor Who in two movies, where he plays the best Doctor, who is human and has a granddaughter and multiple granddaughters, and is a human inventor who invented the TARDIS as a human with one heart because he's human. You see.
You make a joke. Do you know that originally one of Russell T Davies' ideas to point out how much better humans are than Time Lords was to have the Toglophane be the species that caused the downfall of the Time Lords,
That's
and
amazing.
they went no.
Uh, and Peter Cushing also did a lot of radio. In fact, the reason why I bring up the Doctor Who reference is that there was a pilot made of a radio program using Peter Cushing's Doctor Who that would have been a whole radio show, but ended up not working. Um, so he was not a well-known actor, but he's a prolific actor. He was starting to get some actual decent fame around the late 60s in the UK and in Europe. Still wasn't extremely well known in the US at the time, as far as I know. But this was a point where British television and movies were starting to make their way over to the US in more frequency because of the Beatles, primarily. And so Peter Cushing started to get some recognition. And uh, so, for example, part of the reason why the episodes were watched in color was because they knew that America had more color television sets than black and white. And so they wanted to make sure that when they shot this series, it would be marketable in America. And part of the reason they chose Peter Cushing was because they were starting to get a little bit of celebrity in America. So that's Peter Cushing. Now,
So
uh,
he's done nothing else. He's not in anything that was made by an America that anyone would be vaguely familiar with.
what else did he do after the 60s?
You're kidding, right?
I genuinely am not drawing a blank.
Grand Moff Tarkin from Star Wars.
Oh yeah, right. Sorry. It's funny because like it's so not the way he usually plays characters that I almost forget that it was him. Also, who watches Star Wars? God, that movie's overrated.
And so, as long-term listeners know that I have a different screen name every time we do one of these,
Right.
and I actively avoided choosing Tarkin because I didn't know if Eddie remembered, and so instead I went with something obscure that even I barely knew. And he didn't comment on it. He just probably assumed it was a criticism of some kind.
Exactly right. I was just like, oh yeah, that's something to make Chris laugh, and I have no idea what it is. I'm gonna move on with my life.
So he was also in the Avengers season 6. It was like a Cybernauts episode.
Well, okay, yes, but who wasn't in the Avengers? Who was a British actor at that time period? Like
But it dealt with the Cybernauts, Eddie.
but
Come on.
Patrick Troughton was in the Avengers.
But he was in an episode that dealt with the Cybernauts, which is almost an immediate nod to Doctor Who without it even being Doctor Who, because I think that was like in the earlier 60s in Doctor Who.
Right? Yeah, yeah. It's
Destiny. Destiny.
I mean, I make fun, but honestly, if people aren't worried about often accuracy or whatnot, and also recognizing that the movies were made before a lot of the Time Lord stuff was established, the two Doctor Who movies, Peter Cushing, are genuinely delightful. Um, they're just very different from our modern understanding of Doctor Who.
Okay. Here's my question for you then. That's serious because I have no idea. Who the fuck is Nigel Stock?
Uh, Nigel Stock is another one of those actors who did a lot of work in a lot of parts. This was actually probably one of his most well-known roles. Um, he's done a lot of theater work as well as Peter Cushing. Um, he was in some films like The Great Escape. He was in Danger Man, because again, The Avengers, but again, who wasn't? He was in The Prisoner as a character. Um, he was in Time Flight for Doctor Who, if you know people recognize Time Flight as existing.
Time
Uh,
Flight is a episode that occurred.
right, exactly. But sadly, he passed away in '86 due to natural causes. So he was always one of the, I don't want to say bit parts, it's not quite right. He was always a supporting actor. Again, his Watson in this series is probably his largest lead role.
Since you did mention that one of the things Cushing wanted to do was try to move it back closer to the text itself for our homes. Which version do you prefer? Something that's closer to the text of Holmes, or one of like the variants that we've seen so far?
I feel like they all need to be kind of in their time. Um, because you could like it uh Rathbone couldn't have played Holmes the way that Cushing played Holmes because uh the way film technology worked, it couldn't pick up nuance the same way that later film and video cameras could, right? So and also in a loud theater, again with the audio quality they had access to them, they couldn't do quieter moments the same way. So um I feel like it's some of the way that Holmes was presented kind of needed to be happen to reinvigorate him. You need to kind of do a stronger take before you can go back to an authentic take. And the thing is that that's another cycle we see, right? Is minor spoilers, but the authentic Holmes is going to be pretty common for a couple decades, and then we're going to get strong takes. To give examples that we're not going to cover, Young Sherlock Holmes and Basil of Baker Street. Those are two very different adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, but they get people excited about it, and then there's room for more authentic takes to come after those. Um, Without Benedict Cumberbatch doing a modern day reinvention of Sherlock Holmes, we wouldn't have had some of the stuff that came after that. That's a little more authentic. So I don't really have
What about
a clear answer to that.
the Great Mouse Detective?
Yeah, Basil. Sorry, yes, it was called The Great Mouse Detective. Basil Baker Street is the book it was based off of, but yes. And honestly, it's one of the better Holmeses, right? Like the voice actor for Great Mouse Detective is actually really good. It very much channels the spirit of Sherlock Holmes, even though it's a bloody mouth. And frankly, Radigar is one of the better Holmes villains. Uh, he's genuinely good for a Disney villain. Um, but also, again, one was skip over because we're trying to keep to authentic-ish Holmeses for this. Miyazaki did a Japanese run of Sherlock Holmes, which got localized to Sherlock Hound, um, and it was his last television work before he did all of the Studio Ghibli movies. And again, genuinely channeling the energy of particularly kind of a Rathbone
Yeah.
Holmes. Um, so yeah, we had this weird moment in the early '80s where everyone made animal versions of Sherlock Holmes. That just kind of happened. But I mean, to tip my hand a little bit, I generally prefer more authentic interpretations on average, but I would watch Sherlock Holmes or Great Mouse Detective before I'd watch this show again, right?
Okay.
So
Interesting.
authenticity is not a high criteria for me. I will watch Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century before I watch this show again. And I like Sherlock. I mean, Sherlock Holmes 22nd Century is genuinely fun. It's pure 90s kids cyberpunk nonsense, but that's actually part of the reason why I like it.
Okay.
Um, but to kind of talk about this show, uh, the filming behind the scenes apparently was very tense. Um, Before when going into it, everyone was like, this will be fun. Peter Cushing was looking forward to again putting his own authentic stamp on the part because he felt like he got to do some of that with the Hammer horror film, but because it's a horror film, certain things had to adapt and change, and he recognized that. He thought it was a chance to get to the core of the character. Um, and by the end of it, he said you would have to put a gun to my head to have me play Sherlock Holmes again. He uh, apparently the how it was produced was so rushed and so frenetic and so full of problems that most everyone hated it. Even Nigel Stock didn't really talk much about his time on this when he's focused on other parts. Um, and I didn't know that when I watched these. I found out afterwards, but you kind of feel that even just watching this is that there's a bit of reluctance to a lot of what's happening on the screen.
As someone who's not afraid to tip their hand, I'm going to say that this was not as much fun or enjoyable as the other homes that we've had up to this point.
Right? And you would think it would. You would think it'd be, oh, it's Peter Cushing playing Sherlock Holmes. This is going to be fun. And it just wasn't.
Even it was in color, and that was a change in of itself, given what
Hmm.
we've done up to this point. But now, in fact, that this is how bad it was for me. Is that I had to watch these episodes twice to retain anything from them. I I fell asleep during some of them, and that was like I was wide awake. I was having a good day, but I do know now if I ever have insomnia, I'll put on this show.
Right, and this is um one of the it's not this isn't quite the nadir of Sherlock Holmes, um, but it's pretty close to it, right? Because uh, there's just not there's not much choice when we said it was just around 60s. It was like it was pretty much this is more or less what we have to choose from. Um,
We could have scripted our own audio drama, Eddie, just the two of us back and forth, and have done something
right,
about a part with this.
right, and it's what we've run into. What we run into here is, as I mentioned before, the big push in the 60s, the pastiches written in the 60s, of adaptations done in the 60s, is that they're trying to hit for authenticity, and for some reason, it's generally agreed that authenticity means boring. Um, and it's we have because they're treating it like literature. I think it's a big problem. It has to be serious literature, and the way you watch the show, it's shot like like a BBC period drama. There's very little background music. You can almost feel the camera pans at times. It's a costume drama. Everyone's in very authentic costumes and very authentic looking sets, and they're talking very seriously about very serious topics. And you have to understand, at their core, Sherlock Holmes stories are adventure stories. I
Yes.
mean, Sherlock Holmes goes out and makes fun of people and punches dudes and there's exciting chases, and just none of that is apparent on the screen here because there's this weird misstep of like, no, this is what people want when they think Sherlock Holmes.
I will even help you so we can transition to the episode proper. There was an amazing chase scene, Eddie, when they broke out the dog in this episode.
The dog was the highlight of the Sign of Four. Toby
I was,
is great.
but we're not there yet. Just as a teaser, if you have not watched these yet and you're listening to us, this is your chance to go and watch The Sign of Four so you can see Toby's appearance.
Right, right. Um, and to be clear, like, if you haven't watched any Sherlock Holmes, uh, this isn't there's genuinely bad Sherlock Holmes out there. This isn't bad by any
No,
means, right? Um,
it's boring.
Peter Cushing tries his best, Nigel Stock tries his best, but it's part of it is it's some of it, frankly, is the audio quality. Like I said, like there's no uh, British television is still getting its head wrapped around using background music for quote unquote serious drama. If you use lots of background music, that is light entertainment. Whereas if you remember, if you watched the Ronald Howard stuff, there was musical things like every few minutes. And that was very much the American style. Is they from their style of radio, they use music much more prevalently, and that kind of influenced how they did television as a result. Uh, British television hadn't quite adapted to that yet. Uh, if you remember back when we watched some of the early 60s Doctor Who, again, there was fairly light background music. And also all the audio quality is very uniform. And so you have just kind of this constant susurrus of going through it, which can lull you into, frankly, nodding off. So if you can get past that, if you can watch it on its own merits, it's not bad.
So
There's
you
literally only 3 sets, but you know,
you're right, and I agreed earlier. It's not bad. It's dull, and the
it's
thing
dull.
is, if we'd watched it without the context of having seen Rathbone and even Howard, I would have probably been more open and engaging to it. But that, like those, as zany as some of them were, and it's dated, they set a certain pace and an
Right,
expectation associated with them. And then to
right.
shift into this, sort of, it's a shifting of gears. Like you're going at
Yeah,
probably a Mach 9, and then you drop down to a solid 87 miles per hour.
yeah. And I mean, I was surprised because, full disclosure, I didn't watch any of these before we came into this. It's something I've been meaning to watch, and so this is an excuse to finally watch some of it. But I had seen the Hound of the Baskervilles Herbivore, and Cushing is way more energetic in that, but also it's a horror film, right? And so he's constantly having to react and to sell the dread of the setting. And I think what happens, I think Peter Cushing got so wrapped up in not have to be authentic Holmes and be cerebral and intellectual, and everyone else was just kind of exhausted because of the pace of the setting. And so again, it just you're right, it's just boring. Uh,
Before you go into the synopsis, I will point out though that even in this version, Cushing does hint that Holmes and Watson are a couple. There you go. I said it. I put it back out there. Every episode, that is my stance. I stand by it to the end of time.
that is what Chris brings to this entire series is queer reading of Holmes and Watson. So, all right, sign up for it. Miss Mary Morstan arrives at the case. She explains that 10 years ago, her father, Captain Arthur Morstan, arrived in London on leave from his post as a convict guard in the Andaman Islands. He requested her to meet him at the Langham Hotel, but was not there when she arrived. Mary contacted Major John Sholto, a retired convict guard who was her father's only friend in London. However, he denied having seen Morstan, and nothing further had been heard of the captain. 4 years later, Mary received a valuable pearl in the post, a gift repeated once a year for 6 years. With the sixth pearl, she received a letter asking for a meeting, claiming that she was a wronged woman. The only further clue Mary can give Holmes is a map of a fortress found in her father's desk, appended with the words "The Sign of the Four," Jonathan Small, Mohammed Singh, Arthur Morstan, John Shelton, and four cross-like symbols. Following the letter's instructions, Holmes, Watson, and Mary meet a coachman who takes them to the house of Major Shelton's son Thaddeus, the anonymous sender of the pearls. He reveals that Captain Morstan did in fact visit Major Shelton, demanding his half of the treasure that Shelton had secretly brought back from India. In the ensuing quarrel, Captain Morstan suffered a seizure and died. Afraid he would be suspected of murder, Major Shelton buried the body and hid the treasure, leaving out a small gold chaplet studded with 12 pearls. Thaddeus and his twin brother Bartholomew knew nothing of these events until a letter from India caused their father to faint and sicken to his death. On his deathbed, he confessed the truth to them. He was about to reveal to them where the treasure was hidden, where a bearded man appeared at the window, and the Major died of fear. Thaddeus began sending Mary the pearls to make things right, and the brothers searched for the treasure, but instead only found Morstan's corpse. 6 years later, Bartholomew found and withheld it. Thaddeus then contacted Mary so they could both confront Bartholomew and demand their shares. I'm going to stop there. That's roughly 20 minutes of the episode. A lot happens, but you would not know it from watching the show.
You're right. I'm going to point out that Watson puts on a big fake act of trying to hit on Mary a lot to make Holmes jealous. That is what I took away from that 20 minutes.
So, The Sign of Four is an interesting novel to adapt. First of all, this is pretty heavily cut down. The Sign of Four was a novel, and this is cut down to a single television episode. So a lot of stuff was cut. Um, and one of the things that's almost always cut from television adaptations of Sign of Four is at the end of this, Watson marries Mary Morstan because she becomes Mary Watson, who is not a secret government assassin. Before you say anything, Chris.
Damn it. Of course, it's not secret because we know she's a government assassin.
God damn it. Um, so how much of the Watson falling in love with Mary gets kept in is mildly interesting to me when I watch adaptations because if you don't do anything with it, it just comes across as creepy and weird. If you do something with it, then Watson stops living with Holmes, and that changes the dynamic of the show. This episode does nothing to resolve that conflict, and so you just have Watson aggressively hitting on their client for no apparent reason.
Other than to make Holmes jealous. It's how that is literally how it comes across because Holmes makes a few comments throughout the episode about women and how he himself will never be married. And then at the end of the episode, Watson and Holmes are sitting around together, and Holmes is talking about once again only the case is what matters. And after the end of this, I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. After the end of this episode where Holmes makes that statement, that let me know that this series would not be for me.
Right.
Because it loses out on the more physical aspects of Holmes, like you were saying, it only leads into the intellectual side, which is interesting if given a chance to breathe and do something. But it's not. Even in this little brief snippet we have, he's explaining things down to Watson again, which I am not loving. I love
Right.
when they're more of a team, and this does not have that. Watson's just a creeper.
Right. Yeah. Nigel Stock is trying to do something with what limited material he has. Um, but I'm going to be honest here. You can kind of see why Nigel Stock was never really a lead actor, right? He's not really bringing a ton to this, and again, it's weirdly frustrating when we watched a show just last week that's 15 years older than this, and American on top of it, even though filmed in France, as we found out. And I care way more about that Holmes and Watson.
Yeah. And so to hear you say that Stock was in the first seasons of this, and in the second season, it feels like there should have been more of a character there, given he had more time. Which
Yeah.
makes me wonder then if that was because they were bringing on Peter Cushing, who had somewhat of a reputation, that they might have diminished that character to let Cushing's Holmes breathe more, or if there's some other dynamic there.
Right. And how much of it is Nigel Stock was just exhausted by the schedule? How much of it is, like you said, Peter Cushing's our big star that will break us out in America, so we need to make sure that he's front and center. Um, the point is that there's something definitely off, and you put your finger on it. It is kind of his relationship with Mary that is kind of the biggest way of seeing, diagnosing what's going wrong here.
And do we need to talk about Thaddeus? Do we need to talk about that? So, since this is once again an audio medium, people do not see me literally taking off my glasses and putting my hand in my head.
He's one step short of his face palm at this point.
But it's too early in the morning for a face palm. I might like hit myself in the eye.
um, what would you like to talk about? I mean, the fact that the obvious cultural appropriation is happening here.
Yes, and the endless number of stereotypes, that faked fucking accent that was, ugh, ugh.
Yeah. I will say weirdly to this adaptation's credit, um, the sign of the four here is that there are three British men who are fighting over the treasure, and one guard from India who was responsible for acquiring the treasure originally, um, which has the complete inadvertent effect of making nearly everyone who's evil in this story white. In the original novel, uh, the sign of four were three Indian men and Sholto, and it had a very different take on it that wasn't great. It
Yeah.
is one of the rare Doylean missteps of characterizing people of color. Um, and I'm gonna, since we're in this zone here, I was gonna save this for the end, but I'll do it now. Um, Again, because this was so cut down, the miniature uh, native stereotype was cut
Mhm.
down to just a boat scene, so that was also dramatically reduced. But they still had to basically put a kid in brown face at the end of the show, and it's just like, just cut the character entirely if you're gonna go that far, you know?
Yeah. So, ugh. All right. That's all I want to talk about that.
Right. So let's finish this off.
Since you did bring up the kid, I want to point out not specifically about the kid, but Watson holding his revolver over his arm had me laughing the whole time,
Yeah, yeah,
like it
yeah.
was a rifle. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah. Uh, so the party, now accompanied by Thaddeus, heads to Bartholomew's house upon the Cherry Lodge. As they enter the house, the worried housekeeper reveals that Bartholomew has locked himself in his room and refuses to come out. Mary Morrison stays downstairs to comfort the housekeeper while the others rush up to the door. Through the keyhole, they can see Bartholomew Sholto slumped in his chair with a copy of the map in his lap. Holmes and Watson break down the door to discover Bartholomew in a state of rigor mortis. Upon further inspection of the body, Holmes discovers a poisonous thorn above Bartholomew's ear. The treasure box is also gone, though there is a hole in the ceiling where it used to be. Holmes deduces from footmarks and other clues that there are two persons involved in the murder: a one-legged white man named Jonathan Small and a small Andamanese accomplice. Sorry, Andamanese accomplice, who accidentally stepped in creosote. The police arrive and Thaddeus is arrested for the murder. Borrowing Toby, a trained scent-hound from a
What?
naturalist.
Before you get to Toby,
Oh,
I'm taking a slight deviation. Does that mean I know the name here is small, but that makes me wonder if the joke from Mary Poppins about a one-legged man named Smith originated from this.
probably. Probably. It wouldn't surprise me.
There you go. That was it. It was no big deviation, but it just occurred to me is seeing it on the text and hearing you read it.
Let's see. Oh,
That's how,
yeah.
that's how my brain works, people.
Right. Okay. So anyway, the best part of the show. Uh, Toby traces, follows the creosotes, and they manage to trace the pair of thieves back to a boat landing. Learning that Small has hired a steam launch named the Aurora, Holmes, with the help of the Baker Street irregulars, traces the boat to a repair yard. On a police launch, Holmes and Watson pursue the Aurora where it flees the yard. The Islander attempts to shoot a dart at Watson and is shot dead himself. As Chris said, over the arm, because that's totally how you use pistols. Small attempts to flee, running the Aurora aground, but is captured. However, the treasure box is now empty. Small, not wanting to surrender his gems, had them scattered into the Thames during the chase.
What kind of dog is Toby?
The He is explicitly a mix in the novel. I think he is an Irish, not an Irish wolfhound, some kind of scent hound in the TV show, but I can't identify the dog.
Irish Wolfhounds are a lot bigger than Toby would be.
Fair enough. But
As
he's
I
basically.
almost got one, but
Oh, really?
Jill would not have it.
No big doggos?
No, I wanted one now.
Yeah.
Can
You
we
would
just talk
think for
about
someone
Toby
who's
for the
made
next
a dog
hour?
game, I would probably be better at identifying dog breeds, but I am not.
As it has been forever since I read The Son of Four, like decades. I'd totally forgotten about the dog until it popped up here, and I loved it.
Yeah, Toby is the best part of Sign of Four. Um, and this is honestly, this episode, like you said, kind of sadly set you up for what to expect, because problematic elements aside, let's put them aside for the moment. Ultimately, this story is there's a treasure hunt. There's literally a treasure map. There's a cool scene of a dog taking you all over London. There's a boat chase. This should be an exciting story. It is not.
And it's as exciting as it's supposed to be. Now that we're talking about it, it reminds me specifically of John Pertwee's last episode of Doctor Who, where he got to do 30 minutes of going from different vehicles to vehicles that they thought would be exciting. It had the same level of boredom as that does,
Yeah,
from
yeah,
some of how the camera work is done, and things just don't translate well.
right. And I think some of that is honestly um, British cinematography hasn't quite figured out how to do that yet. Um, I mean, obviously, later on, that it will definitely improve. Um, but the British action uh, uh, television hasn't quite happened yet. Again, there are exceptions. Like the Avengers actually is very quite action oriented. The Prisoners action oriented, but in both those cases, you had a very specific creative team who were trying brand new things that no. And the whole time they were told they wouldn't work, and then they ended up being really big. And again, they weren't big in the UK; they were much bigger overseas. It took a while for the UK to recognize the same thing, and it's like maybe we should do that. And then the 70s, they start to do more. Doctor Who gets more action oriented. They do more action oriented like cop dramas and whatnot. So they haven't quite figured it out yet, whereas America's ahead of the curve on that front. So I agree with you. Some of it is just how it's shot, but also um, a lot of the action parts of this are actually explicitly cut out or cut down, and they give much more attention to Mary Morstan bitching about, maybe should I flirt with Watson or not? You know?
It feels more like she will flirt with Watson if he gets her the money, and that doesn't equate
Yeah.
well. That's a bad. Mm.
Right. See, and again, it's weird how it's paced, because in the novel there's a whole subplot of The reason why Watson's being weird is that he knows this woman is going to become extremely rich, and he wants to be a gentleman and not press his affections on her because he doesn't want to come across someone who's just after her money. And then once she realizes that she doesn't have that much money, even though she still has 8 very expensive pearls, so she's not poor. But when this treasure is gone, then Watson goes, okay, well now I feel like I can tell you how much I love you, and they get married. And of course, Mary's like, well, you idiot, I would have said yes either way, right? And so that whole plot makes sense. It's the Watson's conflict is trying to be a gentleman and not trying to take advantage of a woman who's also his client, and waits until the case is over and that the matter of money is put aside before he says anything. And if you cut that part out, but leave all of the flirting in, it looks like she's leading him on until she gets her money, and he's just being a weird, creepy flirt with his clients. And he stops as soon as he realizes she's not rich. So it's
So
the exact
it's kind of all
opposite
over the
of
place.
what the actual storyline's supposed to be.
So yeah, it's yeah.
Um, I can safely say I was not happy with this adaptation.
Yeah, it was like once again, it wasn't bad. It was
No, I mean my frustrations are purely that's me speaking as a Holmes fan. Going, I have seen other adaptations. This is not one of the better ones of this specific story. Um, but just as an episode of Sherlock Holmes TV, it's like okay, that was weirdly dull.
and I'm not loving Cushing's portrayal of Holmes yet. It feels more
No.
lethargic.
Yes. Right. Uh, anything else on the Sign of Four?
Uh I think that in this version that Mary and Thaddeus go off and get married.
Yeah, that's also weird, but
That's
because
it.
he's been sending her these pearls since she was a child.
Yeah. Oh, come on. It's not like Mary and Watson are close in age either.
No, no, no. Although he's in his late 20s in the story at this point, but yeah, it's not great. It's just not great. None of it's great. Don't like it.
All right, we can
Bus-
move on. I've got nothing else about that one. That
the
was
Buscombe Valley Murder. John Turner lives in Hertfordshire. Hertfordshire? I actually don't know how to pronounce that. With Charles McCarthy, a widower who has a son named James. After an altercation with the lodgekeeper Moran, another Moran, Charles walks into the woods followed by James, who's carrying a gun. A witness hears James and his father arguing for seeing James holding his bloody father, who whispers the words, "a rat," before dying. James is accused of the murder, but Alice, Turner's daughter, disagrees. Sherlock Holmes and Watson take a train to Herefordshire, takes a train to investigate. I'm actually going to stop there relatively fast because that encompasses a lot of interesting back and forth timeline stuff that's actually a little unclear what's going on until Holmes and Holmes and Watson come in like 8 or 9 minutes into the episode. They actually come in weirdly late into the story. But did you follow all of this at this point?
yes. But I'm also look at us. We do a podcast about movies and TV medium. Come
Fair.
on. It's asking one of us that question is the same as asking like a casual viewer. But no, you're
Fair.
right. It is convoluted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of more what I was going for is like this is one of the more complex short stories. This is now a short story, not a novel. So this has the opposite problem. They have to expand it slightly to fill their runtime. And they seem to do that by fleshing out more of the scenes from the short story, which is fun. Actually, a good way of doing it. But by presenting a whole bunch of characters up front with no real context of who they are or the relationship to each other, and then going back and forth in time a little bit, it makes me long for the more straightforward adaptations of the client comes in and sits down and explains the case to Sherlock Holmes. Instead, we just have Holmes. And that's the other thing is like Holmes and Watson aren't technically hired; they just go. That's
Well,
another thing that's weird.
even in the next one, they are technically hired, but he doesn't want to be hired. So it's already breaking some of the formula that would have been used to either from reading or having seen previous iterations of the show.
Right. Um, so
Which, in some
it's
aspects, some people would say would be a good thing.
yeah,
But
no, I mean, I applaud the attempt to kind of do something interesting with the formula, and knowing in retrospect this is the second season, I could see why they're okay. Let's kind of break up the formula a bit more because this is now the second series. We've done this a while now. Um, but it does have again the slightly odd effect of we know more about the scene than it appears that Holmes does going into it, which is unusual for a Sherlock Holmes mystery specifically. Usually, you want to have Holmes feel like he's slightly ahead of the reader instead of slightly behind the reader. Anyway, James confirms testimony of the witness, but explains that he was going into the woods to hunt, not to follow his father. He later heard his father calling Cooey and found him
what
standing by the pool.
I am interrupting you. What if, Eddie, he was hunting the most dangerous game? Please go ahead.
God damn it. Found him standing by the pool, surprised to see him. They argued heatedly, and James decided to return to the farm. Shortly after that, he heard his father cry out and returned to find him lying on the ground. James insisted that he tries to help him, but his father died in his arms. James refuses to give cause for the argument, despite the coroner's warning that it could be damaging to his case if he doesn't reveal it. He also thinks he saw a cloak on the ground, which vanished when he was helping his father. Um, Again, I'm going to pause here. I will go through the rest of it, but there's a couple of interesting bits early on. Um, One thing I don't think it's clear in this episode is that this is not a jury trial. This is a coroner's inquest. But how coroners worked in the Victorian era, where they would literally hold a trial just on the state of the body, and then they would deliver a judgment on how the body was ended up dead. So in suspicious activity, they would call witnesses. They would have people come in. They would people testify just like they would in a normal trial, and then the coroner would make a verdict and say that's how the person died. Which is why even today we still the coroner's final determination what happened is still called the verdict. It comes from these trials that used to exist, these inquests.
You know, we also touched on that during Hound of the Baskerville because that's how it kind of opens.
Oh yeah, you're right. We did. This is more. You can see more of what actually happens here, though. You're right. We talked about that in Hound and Baskervilles.
Because it's more alluded to in that, and it's very quickly wrapped up compared to this, where it's almost a crux of the episode.
Right. Well, actually, you can literally see there's a coffin standing right by where the coroner is. It's a little clearer if you know that context. But it's a good point. It's the second time this has come up. I just find this a fascinating little bit of Victorian history. Anyway. After the inquest, Alice talks to Holmes and Dr. Watson, believing she was the subject of the argument between the McCarthys. Charles wanted his son to marry her, but James had refused, which is not what we expect when we hear that. Her father is also against the union. His health worsened after the death of Charles, whom he had known since they were in Victoria, which is in Australia. Holmes and Watson go to the scene of the crime. After examining the ground, Holmes finds evidence of the presence of another man besides Charles and James, whom he believes to be the murderer. Holmes deduces that the killer had a limp and hands Watson a stone that Holmes says is the murder weapon. The two confront Moran, who has a limp, but he declares McCarthy is a bad un who never paid Turner any rent to stay in his home. Holmes then talks to Turner, who also has a limp, in his sick room. Turner confirms he was friends with McCarthy in Australia, although he admits McCarthy was a cruel man. During his discussion, Turner has a hallucination about a coach before falling unconscious. Pause here again, because this is where I got annoyed, right, at the adaptation. Is because the first half of the episode is very complicated, and here's all these nuances and testimony and whatnot, and here's all these different possible suspects, and now it's super fucking clear who the villain is. It's like there's two people with a limp, one of them is immediately disqualified, and the other guy has a hallucination that obviously plays into what's going on here, and it's just like, now we're just killing time for the rest of the episode because we all know what the answer is.
Come on, Holmes has already given Watson the murder weapon.
Which admittedly is a funny scene. But one of the few bits of actual lightness we've had in this series so far. It's like, Juan says, why? That's the murder weapon. Like, that was actually a little funny. Also, the most energy I've seen from both those actors this whole series.
Now, hearing you say that, it does make me think back to the start of the conversation today about how they wanted to stay closer to the text.
Hmm.
This is already then a deviation from the text about how much they're having to fluff the episode.
Yep. Right. Now, um, uh, to be fair, the authenticity we're talking about is purely in the portrayal of Holmes from Cushing's perspective. Um, they're going to adapt and change, and we've said before, all adaptations ultimately adjust and modify the text. Um, there'll be another stab at authenticity that comes in the near future, which we will talk about, um, and is much better for a lot of reasons. So it's still good that we look at this as a kind of dry run of what's going to happen in the late 80s, early 90s. So, but you're right. What's also happening here is that you have one part of the creative team that's obviously trying to be respectful of the original material, another part of the team that's just trying to make good television, and they're not in sync. And so you have
Yeah, because
Cushing
In Sync wouldn't come around to the 90s, I think.
but up in sync. I see what you did there. Um, but no, I mean you have Cushing trying to play a cerebral Holmes who's keeping things from Watson to be a little melodramatic, but the script is not really structured to help that, and so it just comes across as Holmes being kind of a dick, which is a valid Holmes interpretation, but clearly not what was intended.
And I don't feel that we've seen a demonstration of Holmes's brilliance yet. And we're an
No,
episode and a half in.
no, like I said, I mean, we as the audience know what's happening here, so we feel like we're ahead of Holmes. That's not how. And in A Sign of Four, Holmes is just kind of following clues. Which, granted, I mean, he's a detective, he's obviously following clues, but like he's not making any leaps of logic. He's just kind of like, this is the next step, this is the next step, and he's just going through the case. So yeah, you're
It's
right.
just interesting. The more I'm thinking about it now as we're actually discussing it, and I'm not falling asleep watching it, napping.
Mm,
It brings more of these things to mind.
yeah. All right, I'm gonna go through the rest because now we get back to where it get convoluted again for some reason. Holmes decides Moran is not the murderer because obviously he's not, and goes to speak to James in prison. Holmes mistakenly surmises that James is protecting his father's reputation, but it emerges that James was ordered by his father to marry Alice. James actually loves her, but could not follow through with his father's demand because he's already married to a barmaid. At the hotel, Holmes explains to Watson that cooey is an Australian cry and that the apparent reference to a rat is in fact compromises last symbols of Ballarat, a place in Australia. The person Charles was meeting was therefore someone he knew from Australia. Watson recalls a highway known as Black Jack of Ballarat, who was famous about 15 years ago. A barmaid, overhearing his conversation, gets angry and leaves for no apparent reason. Holmes then goes back to John Turner's room to confront him. Turner confesses he was being blackmailed by McCarthy. He planned to meet McCarthy secretly at the pool to resolve the matter. Seeing McCarthy and James there arguing, Turner hid, intending to wait until James left. However, he became hangry when he heard hangry, no, angry. He was hungry. He became angry when he learned the nature of the argument and killed McCarthy to preserve his freedom and spare his daughter. James heard his father's death cry and returns, but Turner was able to hide in the woods. He had to return later to retrieve the cloak he had dropped in his haste. Holmes explains that Turner was Black Jack of Ballarat. His gang robbed a gold convoy in which McCarthy was the wagon driver and saw McCarthy kill one of the miners. Turner moved to England, bought land, and got married, and then Alice was born. Sometime later, McCarthy tracked down Turner and threatened to blackmail him until James and Alice were married. Turner signed his confession before immediately and conveniently dying. Watson says despite everything, John and Alice can't marry because of James's previous marriage. However, Holmes reveals that the barmaid was herself also already previously married, so she dropped the pretense with James and went back to her legal husband. Okay.
Before you get into it, I want to point out something that maybe I just misheard it. 15 years ago, he retired from being Black Jack of Ballarat. Is that what we
Yes.
established?
Roughly 15 years ago, yes.
And then he came back here, got married, and then Alice was born.
Correct.
Alice is 14.
So, yes, the 15 years was injected into the story, into this adaptation. It was much more nebulous in the original short story. Um, but also, so there's a few things. One, The barmaid subplot actually is in the story, uh, but the her overhearing the conversation and storming off isn't. She's just a side character in the background that Holmes like. So, by the way, you're a bigamist, and she's like, yeah, lol. I guess let him go.
Well,
Um,
come on. How many of us haven't fallen in love with a barmaid every now and again?
I haven't. Although my father did because mom was a barmaid. So there you go. Mm.
I've known. Never mind. That's story for later.
Uh,
And the look on Eddie's face right now is priceless.
just
And
moving
that
on.
is why I do these things. Because then you don't know if they're true or if I'm just trying to get a rise out of Eddie.
I just assume they're always false, but we'll go from there. Um,
Dubious assertion, my friend.
uh, like all this stuff is kind of just dumped at the ends. Again, in a story, how it works out is he signs a confession, and Holmes is like, if for some reason the case doesn't fall apart because all of their evidence is circumstantial, which it is, then I'll produce his confession to get him off the hook. And then uh, Blackjack dies several months later, not immediately after he signs the confession. Uh, so, and then again, like the barmaid thing, just even though it's actually in the story, it just feels tacked on because the way it's presented here, it's like, oh yeah, by the way, that barmaid scene that you saw earlier where she was mad for no fucking reason, oh yeah, off screen, I just took care of that. So weirdly paced.
It's almost like they added too much fluff and then realized that wait, we still have plot left that we have to handle.
Right. It's like, if we spent less time of him staring at black and white drawings on the screen for 20 minutes, maybe we could have added more to the barmaid subplot. Or, even better, cut the barmaid subplot and just say, I couldn't marry her because I didn't want to do what my dad told me, which frankly, even in the original story, would have been a better reason. Um,
Or if they're gonna have everything with the barmaid handled off screen, then just mention her and just don't ever show her.
right. Yeah. It's clear they're trying to think of ways to adapt these stories to put them on screen. And it's early days, and they haven't quite figured out the answer to that.
That can't be. But come on, if they're in their second season, they've already had time to figure out what works and what doesn't work first season to move into second season.
That implies a level of understanding that I don't necessarily always apply to people who make television.
Because I was under the illusion this was like the first season. I didn't know this was like a second season. If I had known that, I would have viewed it even more critically.
Right.
Because you have a whole season to like fuck around and figure out what it is you're doing. And even if your lead changes, which is not unheard of in BBC shows we've seen
Yeah.
at this point, even
Yeah.
it shouldn't be as murky as this is.
No, I mean, I generally, especially because there's like several years between the first series and second series. I agree that that's what should have happened, but also I don't agree that that must happen because my Exhibit A, the TV show Lost. Or even Game of Thrones, right? There's some people who put together fantastic television don't know how the fuck they did it. But in this case, it's it feels like there are other constraints here, and I think some of it is the fact that if you watch these episodes, I joked about it before, but in all seriousness, each episode has maybe 3 or 4 sets. So some of the stuff is them having to rework material into significantly less locations. Like I didn't talk about this in Sign of Four, but the scene where Mary comes and asks Holmes for help after I'm sorry, no, it's this episode. Alice comes to talk to Holmes after the inquest, right? That actually takes place in a hotel room. They actually go from the inquest to the hotel room because having this conversation where anyone could walk in on them was this terrible idea, frankly, and they go to a private place to actually have this actual conversation. But because they don't have a hotel room set, they just get together after the inquest and chat about it. So some of these changes are clearly we only have a certain amount of locations to use, and we have to try to get these things crammed into locations we have available to us. So I give them some credit. Doesn't explain the barmaid scene though. She didn't need to be there. That was an own goal. They you didn't have to do that.
Now in my headcanon, it is simply because both Cushing and Stock wanted a beer, and so that's why they put that scene in, so they could drink actually on set.
I refuse to do this scene sober. I will be drinking. You might as well build a bar set.
That's my headcanon.
Right. It
I
also
don't
doesn't
know.
have to. I mean,
Man,
another problem I have is if you're going to do if you're reading the story, knowing the characters are Australian is actually kind of a twist later on. In the adaptation, you should know as soon as these characters opens their mouths, they're Australian. That's actually weirdly hidden until Holmes explains, oh, by the way, these characters are Australian. It's not really clear because the Australian accents are so weak in this.
ugh,
That shouldn't be a plot
yeah,
twist.
I don't know. It my entire closing thoughts is that it was an episode. It looks like it had a happy ending for both John and Alice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, either that or James like fuck the big man. I don't care. I'm doing this. That's because he doesn't know his wife has been sworn off by Holmes. He just goes for it. So anyway,
obviously there might have been a scene they draw, but Holmes off screen went and did more stuff
right.
that he forgot to tell Watson about.
Because and I told James that too. By the way, you know, I don't know. Anything else about the Buscom Valley murder?
She doesn't look 14.
No. All right.
No, that's it. It's I'm
The
bothered by
blue.
the time they specifically added it. That was no
Yeah.
reason to add it in.
They made that choice. Okay. Blue Carbuncle.
You know what? I do have one more thing.
Oh, sure.
The fade out of the flaming death of Black Jack of Ballarat was hilarious.
Yes.
That was the funniest thing out of the 2 episodes I've seen so far. I couldn't stop laughing. That's it.
Yeah, they're clearly trying to be dramatic, and it just is not. Okay,
That's
Blue
it.
Carbuncle. As London prepares for Christmas, newspapers report the theft of a near-priceless gemstone, the Blue Carbuncle, from the Countess of Morker's hotel suite. Lady Morker attempts to hire Sherlock Holmes, but he declines. Later, Dr. Watson finds Holmes contemplating a battered old hat brought to him by Peterson, a commissionaire who seeks Holmes' help in returning it and the Christmas goose to their rightful owners after he found them dropped in the street during a scuffle. Watson studies the hat, and between them deduces Baker's age, social standing, intellect, and domestic status. A name tag on the goose reads Mrs. Henry Baker and is of little assistance as the name is a very common one. Ultimately, Holmes gives the goose to Peterson for dinner, but later an excited Peterson finds a stolen gem in the goose's crop. Meanwhile, the police arrest John Horner, a plumber with a criminal record, who's in the Countess's room repairing a fire grate. Uh, Horner attempts to hang himself in his jail cell, and Watson goes in to check on him and stops the suicide attempt. He believes in Horner's innocent. When Harold, not Henry Baker, appears in response to advertisements that Holmes placed in the London newspapers, Holmes offers to buy him a new goose. Happily accepting a replacement bird, Baker refuses the original bird's entrails, convincing Holmes that he knew nothing about the gem, that he innocently purchased the goose, as he says, at the Alpha Inn, a pub near the British Museum. So, episode 3. Oh, hey, what if we made Holmes clever?
Yep. Yep. And now, based on everything we've seen, I would have to now assume the entire first season did not make Holmes clever at all. He's just
Apparently not.
duding it up with his sidekick.
Right. Um, I have said before when you asked me my favorite stories, I mentioned Blue Carbuncle, and so I was curious to see what his adaptation is because the hat scene is one of my kind of go-to. Here's how to write Sherlock Holmes and Watson correctly. Because this thing actually weirdly is better to Watson than I expected because first of all, Watson gets more right than he does in the original story, and the show actually has Watson fairly accurate. Holmes just builds on them, and then in the story, both in the story and the adaptation, Watson's like, "How do you know it's Henry Baker?" And Holmes explains, "Well, blah 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 blah." And in this story, that deduction is proved wrong, which is not in the original story. So the Harold Baker twist is actually new to the adaptation to make Holmes wrong. And Cushing looking offended by the man's first name is the best thing I've seen him do this entire fucking series. Like, how dare you come into my house and tell me your name is Harold when I know for a fact it is Henry? It's so good.
Oh god, yes, that was spot on. Like that was good.
And in a way, like the first half of this episode, I got mad because I'm like, why wasn't the whole show like this?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I enjoyed this piece. I was not expecting to after the other two, but to finally get something that was enjoyable and somewhat engaging.
Yeah. Let me do the second half then real quick because there's more to this. So Holmes and Watson go to visit the pub where the proprietor informs them that the bird has been purchased from a Covent Garden dealer named Breckenridge. However, Breckenridge refuses to help, complaining that he has been repeatedly pestered by another man about geese purchased by the Alpha Inn. Realizing he's not the only one aware of the goose's importance, Holmes tricks the dealer into revealing the bird was supplied to him by its breeder, Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton. The dealer's other pesterer arrives. It is James Ryder, head attendant to the hotel where the gem was stolen. Back in Baker Street, a remorseful Ryder admits that he and his accomplice, the Countess's maid, had contrived to frame Horner, believing that his criminal past would make him an easy scapegoat. During a visit to his sister, Mrs. Oakeshott, Ryder decides to feed the gem to the goose he had promised him as a gift, but he confused the bird with another. By the time he realizes his mistake, the goose had already been sold. As it is Christmas, Holmes takes pity on Ryder and allows him to leave England, concluding that the latter is too frightened by what happened to offend again. Horner is freed once the case against him collapses, and Holmes returns the carbuncle to the Countess. And so, like, him and Watson rushing around London in the winter to try to get this information is, again, the most energy I've seen out of either of these actors this entire show.
Yes, and so I'm just going to jump around now since we've done the entire thing. The scene between him and the person dealing in the gooses when he says to Watson, I guess that means like you've lost the bet,
Yep.
and get the person engaged with it. That was gold. Like that's another
Yeah.
bit of something because then it shows Holmes still being smart, but not overly smart, saying that talk about how he knew that him losing a bet would have been worth more to that guy for like £5
Mm-hmm.
and him actually paying him £400.
Yeah.
That is good character development. That shows that Holmes is out on the street a lot doing some sort of investigative work. So he has an understanding of people and
Yeah.
something that Watson in society would not necessarily know because Watson would have probably just tried to bribe him.
Right.
Good
And
dynamics here.
there's good comedic bits that aren't in the original story, like when Holmes is like, we have to go do this, so face fronts, and we'll march into the winter, and Watson facing the opposite direction and him turning Watson the right way. A little bit of comedic comedy, but also off the Countess stuff, completely new adaptation. Holmes just straight up refusing to take a rich person's money because he's bored with her shit is completely new. And I was here for it. And then she's like, "Well, I was gonna hire you again. I was gonna give you another chance." And Holmes is like, "Whatever. Here's your fucking gem. Go away." It was great.
And the Watson beat saying that he'd pay to see that happen again. It's like nice. Like those are good.
Yes, and so we have something we've had this a few times in past episodes, but there's rare moments like there's one good episode that makes you angry that the rest of the show isn't like this one good episode.
Now I'm curious if episodes after it realizes that the bit it's missing or bits is Holmes being smart and a touch of humor. Because the other episodes didn't have any humor, and it does, and I don't mean like a lot of humor, just small little interjections of it that makes a drama more enjoyable.
Right, and this is where some of the frustration gets in because, as far as we know, 13 episodes of this series were filmed. We've recovered four of them in their entirety, which you watched three of those. And we've since recovered bits and pieces of other episodes that were shown on different clip shows and whatnot, like interview shows or one that show a clip of the episode. We found bits and pieces of the other episodes of four more. Um, but I mean, so for all we know, you're right. The later episodes or the other episodes around this may have much more of this energy. It helps that, again, no pun intended, but the Blue Carbuncle is a rare lost gem of Holmes canon, because I think it's a genuinely good story, because it does show Holmes and Watson at their peak doing really good stuff. It's just a well written story, and this thing just adds to that, as opposed to the previous adaptations where they do weird cuts and move things around and diminish the story. This one actually improves on the story in a couple of different ways. We don't know if the rest of the show is like this, and if so, now I'm even angry that we've lost these episodes, because Peter Cushing as Sherlock Holmes maybe was amazing, and we just don't know it, because most of what we see is not him being amazing.
No, not at all. But I liked the twist, how we talked about, and the humor at the end. I cannot stress enough how important that was. Even though
Mm-hmm.
we started with a love story and
Yes.
ended on Holmes getting a confession and letting someone go,
Right.
which reinforces he's not the police. Given that during the course of these episodes, we've had people treat Holmes like he is the police,
Mm-hmm.
like going to him first and foremost, like even not detectives, but footmen are coming to him and addressing him as if he is a chief inspector,
Right.
which feels off and wrong. They're not like giving him information, but more answering to him to be sent out by him.
Right. And another reason why I like Blue Carbuncle is because you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the line, I am not hired to supply the inadequacies of the police. And he absolutely takes justice in his own hands, something he does in a number of stories, actually. And I like the Holmes that is like, I'm a private citizen. I can make whatever decisions I want to. And again, it's not in this story, but I'm glad to see it here. A Holmes who does not suffer fools gladly, regardless of how much money they have. This is a home that does not care about the class divide. He absolutely will work wherever, because he only cares about the case, and he only cares about justice. He is not purely a clinical machine, although he's often portrayed as such. And this story is like, no, he has a strong sense of justice. Like, going, this man just made a mistake, and now with the counter stuff put in, you get this interesting story of someone going, this man just needed money. This woman can absolutely spare it. So I'm not going to arrest this man because he's poor.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where that's the kind of stuff I see Peter Cushing going, no, this is what Holmes would do. This is how Holmes would pitch it. And I'm seeing that here finally, right, throughout this episode, particularly near the end, his anger not at the criminal, but at the situation. And it's very clear that's where his anger is placed in his performance. And that's like, yes, that's Holmes. And so I'm finally seeing the Holmes who jokes with his friends. The only casualty that I would like to have seen, and it's still here, but it's not quite pitched the same way, is that when Holmes on the spot goes, "Oh, well, I had a bet with Watson," and he structures it so that he loses the bet so he gets the information, and then Watson goes, "Wait, you owe me money," and forces Holmes to pay in front of the guy. In most adaptations, that's played a little more for humor, because Holmes is like, "But that's not the point." And in this one, it kind of it's still there. It still works, but that's one of the few points where that kind of jokiness of Watson going, if you're gonna keep putting me in situations where I have to back up your stories, we're going we're going to the hilt with this. And Holmes going, fine, you know. But again, that's a minor gripe. Overall, I got the end. Oh, thank God! Like, at least there's something good. Again, it wasn't bad. The other ones were just kind of dull. This one had some energy and life and dynamism that the show desperately needed.
100% agree.
So, anything about final thoughts about the 1968 Sherlock Holmes? Because the downside of doing this run is that they're all called fucking Sherlock Holmes. You have to clarify which show you're talking about.
Just that I'm glad I will not have to ever watch it again.
You can buy it on DVD if you want.
Seriously, no. It does make me now want to go rewatch the Hammer horror Peter Cushing as Sherlock Holmes in The Hound of Baskervilles. All right, I'm gonna go in a slightly different direction. Now that we've seen 3 different iterations of Watson, what is your ranking of preference for the 3 Watsons that we've seen? Oh, you're on the spot now, buddy.
Okay, so I have given Nigel Bruce a lot of stick, right? But I would still watch Nigel Bruce over Stock, honestly. Um, I almost hate to say that, but Nigel Bruce has a it's just even if I'm mad at his portrayal at Watson, I'm still really enjoy the energy he brings, right?
Yeah. He's has almost a magnetic charisma to him that makes you want to watch him, even if he's being goofy.
Right, right. But honestly, Ronald Howard's Watson. I forget the actor's name, sadly. But so far of what we've seen, I like him the most. He's got the right balance of comedy and skill, and not putting up with Holmes' bullshit. That is genuinely great. How
100%
about
agree.
you?
Like that is my almost my order too. Like the Howard, then Bruce, then Stock. It's just Stock feels like part of the background and not a partner or even a sidekick.
Right. Yeah. And it is weird. Like I knew kind of going into this how I thought how this run was going to follow. We're still going through it. Um, but honestly, when I was putting it together, I was like, oh, I'll throw the Ronald Howard stuff in just in the 50s, and it was okay. I remember it being okay, but it's weirdly become like quite the hidden gem of this whole run so far.
Because it's the 27 odd minute episode run is nice in and of
Yeah.
itself, which means they have to go at a faster pace, but they're not losing much of the mystery by doing that. And they're still giving
Hmm.
you like a whole bunch of plot, like we're done and we're out.
Yeah. Like, let's go back to Buscom Valley Mystery for a second. Like that, there were stories that were just as complicated in the Ronald Howard run in half the time, and were way more interesting to watch.
And I wonder if the concern here might be that they had too much time they had to fill. And if
Yeah,
they
maybe.
could have edited down just 10 minutes would have made a difference.
Right. Um, but again, like I mean, some of it is just like I said, how it was shot. It was shot very much kind of um, what we now call three camera style, where they actually set up three cameras and just cut between them, as opposed
Mhm.
to single camera where they shoot it from one perspective and then reshoot it from a different perspective and reshoot it again from a different perspective. Um, so I mean that loses some energy because that's much more how sitcoms and costume dramas are filmed. Um, Not much in the music, not much in the sound effects. Um, there was really no audio variability until you get to like Blue Carbuncle, um, where actors were starting to put some heft into their performance. Um, so yeah, it's when people say Peter Cushing and Sherlock Holmes, that should be amazing. He is, but this isn't it. Like you said, guy, I do recommend going check out the Hammer horror one. It's goofy. It's Hammer horror. It's everything that you expect from a Hammer horror film. We've talked about this before. Um, we've given some recommendations. So if you can recognize that level of '60s gore question mark, uh, uh, it's very much that. But it definitely is a much better adaptation of Cushing doing what he could do with Sherlock Holmes. And frankly, Cushing it seemed like he was more into the role in that movie than he seems to be here.
Any other thoughts at all about the 60s version of Holmes here?
I hate to say it, but I'm with you. I'm probably not going to seek this out again. You know?
I'm excited though that for the next one, it is not just called Sherlock Holmes. Next time we do this, in fact, it is
Yes.
a total change. We don't even have Holmes in the name of what we're going to talk about.
What are we going to talk
So
about,
for
Chris?
anyone that's curious, we're going to jump up maybe 4 or 5 years, I think, from the 60s into the 70s with Murder by Decree. It's a
Mm.
movie. I saw it when I was younger. I watched it with my grandmother twice. So I remember liking it. We'll find out if that still holds true or if I will like go in and just like start bashing it from top to bottom and talking about how Christopher Plummer was a hack and all he should be doing is plumbing. We don't know. We'll have to wait until we talk about that one next time.
I've also seen this movie a couple times, so it's I have opinions, and also the '70s is an interesting time period in Sherlock Holmes too. So it'll be fun to talk about. So until then, if people wanted to talk to you about your memories of watching Murder by Decree, where would they find you?
You can find me on all the social medias currently as a Darker Hue. The best place if you want to talk to me is to come to the Darker Hue Discord. That maybe I'll drop a link again to make it active so people can join the Discord. If you want to support me, come to my Patreon because that's where I'm dropping stuff right now. Unless I take some secret projects because Redacted will be published one day in the future. Who knows? 2087, 2077. Who can tell? What about
Wow,
you?
2077. Hey, much more optimistic.
I had to move it up a little bit because I want to retire somewhere in there. So that last 5 years will be when I retire.
um, if you want to find me, you can find me most anywhere as Pug Steady. That's my website. That's my social media. PUG as in a dog. STEADY as in hold steady. I do also have a Patreon, although it's kind of on hold at the moment because I've got a lot of work on. So I'm trying to get caught up on work before I get back to writing for Patreon. So I will be writing silly dog stories again soon, I promise. But I've got to, get keep my job going, self-employed. So yeah, or find me on the Darker Hue Discord, where right now um, I'm talking about. Actually, I'm not talking about much of anything. I should probably dump some more links and stuff in there. Oh, I did see you posted the fact that the 13th Doctor is getting radio dramas very quickly. Actually,
Yeah, I'm glad for them. I hope
yeah,
because if they're with Big Finish, they should get some good scripts, and then people could
yeah,
really see how good Jodie could have been.
yeah. I'm super excited for that. And they have 12 they're releasing. So like they're not doing just a couple. They're really in on Jodie. So I'm super excited about that.
But I'm also
Um,
curious now, since we're deviating a little bit. What's Jodie doing these days? Like I haven't seen her in anything.
she was in a prison drama recently. Um, and I think she's got something else lined up, but not like David Tennant levels of work.
Or Matt Smith, I would say, levels of work because
Yeah,
Matt Smith's in everything. It looks like.
that's true. That's true. So yeah, I think she has a little more free time. But yeah, no, I'm excited because that means that we're down to only a couple of living doctors who aren't on a Big Finish right now.
Yeah.
So cool. So with that, we will see you next week. We talk about Murder by Decree. See you then.